The Zone of Interest is the 2023 critically acclaimed film by Jonathan Glazer, which follows the life of Auschwitz commandant Rudolf Hoss and his family as they go about their daily lives right next to the infamous concentration camp. It shows the unsettling juxtaposition between the comfort felt by the well-off Hoss family and the atrocities committed just over the other side of the wall. In reality, this was very much the case. Nazi officials of all ranks simply went about their comfortable day-to-day lives, whilst huge populations of people were being systematically murdered, and in some cases, literally on their doorstep. It can be argued that Adolf Hitler experienced this comfort more than most, as we will explore in today's video. When Hitler wasn't actively taking part in political action, he spent much of his time at the Berghof, a picturesque holiday home in the Bavarian Alps. In fact, with the exception of his headquarters in East Prussia, he spent more time at the Berghof than he would at any other location during the course of his time as the Fuhrer. Today, we will be exploring the history of the Berghof in detail, discovering how it was used and how the land it sat on came under the possession of one of history's most reprehensible figures. Welcome to Wars of the World. The Berghof began its life as a small chalet in the very southeasternmost tip of Germany, near to Berchtesgaden, in the Salzburg mountain retreat of the Bavarian Alps. It sits right on Germany's border with Austria, in a picturesque location that overlooks miles upon miles of mountains, foothills and pine forests. Before Hitler owned the property, it was known as Haus Wachenfeld, and was constructed in 1916 by the entrepreneur Otto Winter, who used the building for personal business. Not far away was the Platterhof, a luxury hotel enjoyed by Hitler in 1922. He already knew the region well. Shortly after Hitler's stay in the Platterhof, the family running the hotel moved on, and Hitler was not too friendly with the new owners. He would move from hotel to hotel over the course of the next few years, becoming a frequenter of the Salzburg retreat, before eventually setting his sights on Haus Wachenfeld in 1928. By this point, Otto Winter had passed away, and his widowed wife was running the business he left behind. Hitler would become a keen customer in the autumn of 1928, beginning to rent the chalet that he would find ideal for his recreational needs. Hitler eventually purchased Haus Wachenfeld from the Winter family in 1933. He had managed to pay for it by saving the funds that he had accumulated from the writing of his controversial political book, Mein Kampf, and by using the money he had left over from its sales, he was able to refurbish the small chalet into a sprawling holiday home. Hitler employed a series of architects and interior designers to achieve his ideal layout for the home, and before too long, it looked like an entirely different place. It was finished by 1936 and renamed the Berghof, or Mountain Court in English. Throughout the remainder of his life, Hitler would use the Berghof often, and it would become a staple location not just for his guests and visitors, but for Nazi propaganda as a whole. Hitler's renovations to the Berghof were constructed around Haus Wachenfeld, keeping the west wing of the house roughly as it was before he made the purchase. The exterior of the Berghof was modern and exquisitely decorated, with two terraces on the front and the side of the house. Postcards from the time show these terraces decorated with flowers and hedges, with parasols and garden chairs set up overlooking the mountains of Austria off in the distance. These views were available all around the Berghof, and several rooms boasted balconies where residents could overlook the dramatic landscapes of the Alps. The house itself was sat upon a hill, up to which led a wooden walkway that Hitler would traverse each day for his frequent trips to the Münzlanerkopf tea house, a beautiful wooded walk where the dictator could exchange pleasantries with his closest friends and allies on the way to get a hot cup of tea. Hitler was often reported to use the tea house to relax, and it was considered to be his favourite place on the Salzburg, outside of the Berghof itself. He would even be frequently spotted napping there. Outside the Berghof, Hitler would often be met with huge flocks of admirers from the general public. He would greet them while standing at the end of his driveway, but would eventually complain about the lack of shade in the location at the height of summer. So he had a tree installed where he would typically stand to make it more comfortable for himself. The main entrance of the Berghof was accessed via a wide, grand staircase, upon which many important photos were taken of Hitler and other historical figures over the years. Italy's Mussolini, Britain's Neville Chamberlain, and more have all been photographed on these stairs during their visits to meet with Hitler. Just through the main entrance was a spectacularly designed corridor where pillars supported ornate curved arches that stretched in all directions. This corridor led to all of Berghof's main features, including the upper floors and the living quarters on the ground floor. Most visitors will be led to the Great Room, the largest of the rooms in the Berghof. This vast hall, adorned in sculptures, paintings, a grand fireplace, and decorative tapestries, was used as a meeting room for Hitler's visitors, and was complete with film projectors, where the dictator could entertain himself and his guests. The first floor also consisted of Hitler's office, where more private meetings were held, the sunroom, where guests and residents could relax in the warmth of the morning sun through tall glass windows, and the kitchen, where lavish meals were prepared for the dictator and his guests. Traveling up the staircase from the main corridor, one could access an office for Rudolf Hoss, Hitler's deputy Fuhrer, as well as additional offices for his secretaries, and private rooms for the friends of Hitler's partner, Eva Braun, to stay. Elsewhere on this floor was the Berghof's dining room, complete with a huge table that could seat up to 16 guests, encircled by wooden walls carved with decorations. Hitler would sit on the right-hand side of the table, right in the middle, facing the window that overlooked the Alps. When the war started and the Holocaust began, the Berghof represented one of the greatest inadequacies in all of Nazi Germany. While millions of persecuted people were being rounded up and systematically murdered, the man in charge of the regime responsible for it all was napping in the tea houses and dining in lavishly adorned mountainside retreats, careless of the horrors taking place in his country. The aforementioned film, The Zone of Interest, shows evils which words alone are very difficult to achieve. This truly was one of the darkest periods of time the human race has ever experienced. It wasn't long before the beauty of the Berghof and the picturesque surroundings it sat in became a powerful image in the Nazis' propaganda. The Nazis wanted to paint a picture of Hitler's Germany as one of the most glorious places on earth, a land of perfect mountains and unspoiled woodlands, where the country's father-like leader could be seen enjoying himself and winding down like any other German. The Berghof would often be shown in news pieces, both within Germany and internationally, where Hitler would often be shown appreciating art, reading, relaxing with his associates, or taking in the surroundings of the Alps. This helped to put him in a positive light, not only to his own people, but to the wider world stage too, allowing him to get away with much more when the cameras were switched off. These pieces portrayed him as a kind individual who loved his friends and family, a man well versed in culture and the arts. A great effort was made to make Hitler the focus of any stories surrounding the Berghof, and Nazi propaganda painted him to be essentially the sole designer, architect, and decorator of the home, although in reality, the bulk of the work was done by renowned architects and planners. This propaganda led to the mass drawing in of tourists, as mentioned in the previous segment, who would flock to the Berghof in great numbers in the hopes that they might be able to catch a glimpse of Adolf Hitler. While Hitler was welcoming at first, he soon grew tired of the constant stream of visitors and took measures to secure the area. Barracks were set up for SS guards to patrol the Berghof, who closely monitored a no-access zone surrounding the perimeter of the site. When the war eventually broke out, the Berghof was armed to the teeth, with anti-aircraft guns mounted on the hillsides and huge smoke-generating machines that would hide the entire site from the Allied forces from above. As well as members of the SS, Hitler was also closely protected by the Fuhrer escort command whilst at the Berghof, and on top of this, members of the Reich Security Service. Additional buildings were constructed within the secure perimeter to house these men. Hitler used the Berghof as a central point for his meetings with many famous figures, who included, but were not limited to, politicians, monarchs, and diplomats. Prior to the outbreak of the war, Hitler would frequently entertain very well-known guests at his mountainside retreat, where he would talk diplomacy, future plans for Germany, and build political relations with the leaders of other countries. Hitler personally met and entertained the likes of David Lloyd George, the Duke and Duchess of Windsor, Neville Chamberlain, Aga Khan III, Benito Mussolini, and more during his time at the Berghof, as well as many German guests that would see him orchestrate and implement the Third Reich. The master of Nazi propaganda, Joseph Goebbels, would be frequently seen at the Berghof, and Hitler is known to have met with Otto Dietrich, the head of the press for Nazi Germany. Baldur von Schirach, the leader of the Nazi youth, was also an infrequent visitor. On top of these political visits, Hitler would also exchange pleasantries with key figures in popular German media. Over the course of his time as Fuhrer, Hitler would orchestrate meetings with poets, playwrights, painters, singers, musicians, and more. One of his most frequent visitors from the media was Dietrich Eckart, the poet who effectively mentored Hitler into his position as the Nazi leader. The two would often meet, exchanging pleasantries and ideas on how to strengthen the regime, and reinforcing the theories and beliefs that would shape the Nazi Party over time. As Hitler's infamy grew and more information came to light about the atrocities committed by the Nazi Party, Hitler's eagerness to use the Berghof as a political tool would come close to prematurely ending his regime and his life on more than one occasion. The first took place on the 11th of March 1944, when Captain Eberhard von Breitenbuch arrived at the Berghof with plans to shoot Hitler in the head, carrying a pistol that he managed to conceal from the SS guards at the front gate. Breitenbuch came very close to achieving his goal, but the guards inside the Berghof would not let him into the same room as Hitler when he arrived. Colonel Klaus Schenkgraf von Stauffenberg planned to achieve the same goal just a few months later on June 7, 1944, and prepared to plant a bomb inside the Berghof at what would have been a key Nazi meeting. But his conspirators cancelled the plan at the last minute when they learned that other important Nazi figures, such as Himmler and Göring, would not be attending. Just a few weeks after this, the British orchestrated a plan known as Operation Foxley. This plot involved having a sniper to assassinate Hitler while he walked between the Berghof and the tea house. The sniper would be parachuted into the region whilst wearing a German uniform. However, due to a lack of intelligence and confidence, the plan did not go ahead. But even if it did, they may not have achieved their goal. Hitler had stopped visiting the Berghof after the 14th of July 1944 and never returned to his holiday home. After this, he would spend much more time at the Wolfschanze headquarters in Poland, possibly due to the frequency of the assassination attempts that took place on his life at the Berghof. Today the Berghof lies in ruins. This is the product of a targeted air raid by the British Royal Air Force's Bomber Command, which took place on 25th of April 1945 over the entire Obersalzberg region. The Allies aimed to help ground forces in the Obersalzberg while showing any Germans who still supported the Nazis that the war was well and truly lost. While Hitler had long fled the region, his officers, guards, strategists and more were still operating in the Obersalzberg right up until the final days of World War II. To target them would put yet another thorn in Hitler's side. While many buildings in the raid were entirely leveled, the Berghof was only damaged, but still it was rendered unusable, as 359 heavy bombers from Britain, America and Australia travelled over the mountains, barraging the region with explosives. This would be one of the very last bombing efforts of the Second World War. It was an objective victory for the Allies. While anti-aircraft guns took out 2 bombers, killing 4 Royal Air Force operatives in the process, the bombers directly killed 31 Nazis, whilst also obliterating several of the buildings which they relied upon. Around 3,000 Nazis are believed to have taken refuge in nearby shelters. However, there would have been little left for them once they had emerged. Amongst these Nazis was Hermann Göring, one of the most powerful figures in the Nazi Party and the only senior Nazi present at Obersalzberg when the raid took place. In the end, he survived the raid. The success of the raid was celebrated by the Allies shortly after, but quickly fell into the depths of historical obscurity. The Allies initially believed that the Nazis were stowed away in a colossal Alpine fortress. However, when they bombed the Obersalzberg, they only found a select few bunkers, houses, offices, and the Berghof. Following the air raid on Obersalzberg, the entire region was abandoned by the Nazis over the course of the next few days. Ironically, it was the SS in these coming days that did more damage to the Berghof, on Hitler's orders, than the Allied bombers. They destroyed Hitler's abandoned home before fleeing the region. Shortly after the Nazis fled, American and French troops would move in to secure the region, and to loot anything that the Nazis left behind. Due to the seniority of many of Obersalzberg's residents over the years, this would become one of the largest lootings of any area associated with the Nazis after their defeat. The Americans eventually took control of the area following the war, where they established a recreation center for military personnel. Today, little can be seen of the Berghof, except from sparse instances of wooded rubble, and the only historical building that still stands now acts as a refurbished restaurant and tourism center. On a more unfortunate note, following the war, the ruins of the Berghof and other Nazi sites at Obersalzberg were frequented by neo-Nazis who would travel to the region to pay tribute to Hitler and his men. To combat this hateful agenda, government officials in Bavaria opted to destroy these buildings once and for all. The US Army closed the aforementioned recreation center, and it became the site of a resort in the early 2000s. A museum now stands at the site to denote the history of Obersalzberg from a factual and ethical standpoint. And several signs denote the ruins or former sites of key locations, one of which is the Berghof. While the Berghof now lies in ruins, it still remains a site of some of the most inadvertent evil that the Nazi regime ever saw. Just imagining some of the discussions and the plans that took place there is enough to cause unease, and it is much better that such a place now exists primarily in the archives of a museum. Just 5 days after the Allied bombing of the Berghof and the Obersalzberg region, Adolf Hitler himself would end his own life, marking a very objective end to his reign of terror over Nazi Germany, before the Allied forces rolled into Berlin. The Berghof now remains as little more than an obscure remnant of World War II history, lost to the ages of one of the greatest evils mankind has ever experienced.